by passing 3 new laws that go into effect this week. Maine's ICE out of policing law will limit Maine law enforcement's participation in the federal government's mass deportation campaign. ICE out of our homes prevent landlords from weaponizing immigration status among their tenants. And ICE out of our schools and state healthcare protects our access to sensitive locations like schools, state healthcare facilities, and libraries, places that Mainers depend on to live and thrive, and places that are the foundation of safe and healthy communities. These new laws will affect hundreds of entities, including 253 school districts, 107 police departments, and 17 housing authorities. Together, these laws are proof that people in Maine and our elected officials will not sit idly by when our neighbors are in need. You're going to hear from Sue Roche from Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project about the connection between these laws and what they're hearing from their clients. Michael Cabede from ACLU of Maine about the ICE out of policing law. Ben Gaines from Maine Equal Justice about the ICE out of our homes law. And Ruben Torres from the Maine Immigrants Rights Coalition about the ICE out of schools and state healthcare law. After our remarks, there will be time for questions. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to submit questions and be sure to include your name and outlet. I'll now hand it over to Sue Roche, the Executive Director of Maine Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project.
Thank you, Zach. Good morning. My name is Sue Roche, and I'm the Executive Director of the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project, or ILAP. ILAP is Maine's only statewide immigration legal aid organization. We serve immigrant communities who would not otherwise be able to afford an attorney, including providing emergency legal help to Maine residents who are swept up by ICE and Border Patrol. In early 2025, ILAP began to see high levels of immigration enforcement all across the state. One of the first cases that showed us both the tactics and the extreme cruelty of the federal administration's mass deportation plan involved a 17-year-old from Lewiston. He was a passenger in a car on his way to his first day of work at a new job. Maine State Police pulled over the driver for traveling in the passing lane and called Border Patrol, and handed him both the driver and the teenager over to Border Patrol. He was held in a detention facility away from his mother for approximately 6 months. After that arrest, ILAP began seeing case after case of Maine state and local law enforcement actively assisting the federal administration with meeting their enforcement quotas. In 2025, ILAP trapped more than 50 Maine residents who were handed over to immigration officers by Maine state and local law enforcement during what appeared to be pretextual traffic stops with rampant racial profiling. Reasons for the stops included driving 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, having a fog light when there was no fog, snow on the car, and an uncentered license plate, a loud exhaust, and similar examples. Those handed over included an uncle who showed up at a traffic stop after his nephew called him for help moving his car, a woman who stopped to help someone who had been involved in a traffic accident, and people on their way to and from work, and people who had themselves been in car accidents. And while no one, regardless of immigration status, should ever be subjected to the violence of mass detention and mass deportation, we note that the vast majority of the people who have been handed over to ICE or Border Patrol by Maine's law enforcement were people in lawful immigration processes who had no criminal record. They were everyday Maine residents. In addition to getting Maine's law enforcement to divert our state's resources to assist with mass deportation, we also witnessed ICE using our schools and healthcare facilities to target immigrants during the January 2026 ICE operation. ICE agents stalked schools and bus stops outside of hospitals, arrested parents after drop-offs, and followed kids home from school. The administration's extremist and violent immigration agenda impacts all of us. Since 2025, ILAP's clients have shared stories about how they've been forced to withdraw from public life to try to stay safe. People are afraid to send their children to school. They're afraid to go to work, apply for new jobs, seek higher education, or to have any contact with Maine's law enforcement, which includes seeking protection or reporting crimes. When members of our community are too afraid to go about their daily life, to educate their children, to share public safety or public health information, we are all harmed. The ICE killing of Johann Sebastian Duran Guerrero, a beloved father, husband, brother, neighbor, and member of our Maine community, has deepened this shared trauma and will have an ongoing ripple effect in our state. The ICE outlaws are a necessary and key part of Maine's response to the federal administration. They are needed to protect all of us and to begin to repair some of the trust in Maine's public institutions where the trust has been lost. ILAP applauds and is grateful for the immigrant communities who fought for these laws, as well as our partners, Maine's nurses and teachers, our state representatives, our legislative champions, including Representatives Dalek, Sato, Rana, and Senator Dusan, and many others. While Maine cannot completely bar ICE from our state because that agency is under federal jurisdiction, we can and we must maximize the tools and protections that we have available to us at the state and local level. ILAP is committed to working alongside the state of Maine and other partners to ensure these laws are fully implemented and upheld. At the same time, we demand that Congress defund and dismantle ICE, and we call for a Maine and a United States that is home for all. Now I'm going to turn things over to Michael.
Thank you, Sue. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Cabetta, and I'm Policy Director at the ACLU of Maine. Last November, the Franklin County Sheriff's Office received a report that a car had driven off the road and was in a ditch with airbags deployed. Officers went to the scene and minutes later called Border Patrol. Border Patrol arrived and took the driver into custody. Two friends called 911 to help a third who was drowning. The sheriff responded, called Border Patrol because they spoke Spanish, and the two were detained. Our public records webpage lists dozens more stories like this, stories where state, county, and municipal law enforcement in Maine used routine traffic stops and emergency calls to support federal immigration enforcement operations. That is the opposite of public safety. People are more likely to report a crime, serve as a witness in court, and call for help if they know their police are not acting as deportation agents. To address this problem, we and advocates at Merck, ILAP, and other organizations championed LD 1971, which became the ICE out of policing law. By making sure local resources are not used to support the deportation machine, this law will make Maine communities safer by building community trust in government officials and ensuring every person can call for help in an emergency, regardless of their immigration status. The ICE out of policing law limits Maine law enforcement's participation in federal immigration enforcement in several ways. Here are 5 important ones. First, it prohibits civil immigration detention in Maine jails, including honoring ICE detainers, Border Patrol holds, and ICE detention contracts. Second, it prohibits jail communications with ICE about the release dates of people being detained. Third, it prohibits police handovers to ICE. Fourth, it prohibits the use of immigration enforcement officers for interpretation services, which often lead to custody and deportation. And finally, it prohibits 287G agreements, which deputize Maine police to perform federal immigration enforcement. An important part of the ICE out of policing law, which originated from a bill that was LD 2058, makes clear that a mandate requiring county jails to accept individuals arrested by other law enforcement agencies does not extend to people arrested for civil immigration violations. ICE out of policing has very broad applicability. It regulates any agency in Maine, quote, charged with enforcement of state, county, or municipal laws, or with managing custody of detained persons, including any employee or agent working for them. That includes not just police departments and sheriff's offices, but also state agencies responsible for enforcing labor law, environmental law, housing law, or any other state or local law. Moreover, ICE out of policing not only limits collaboration with ICE and Border Patrol, but also with any effort to investigate, enforce, or assist in the investigation or enforcement of federal civil immigration law by any, quote, person performing immigration enforcement functions, whether that person is a federal, state, or local officer. This means that if the federal government created a new immigration enforcement agency or started using any existing federal agency for immigration enforcement, our ICE out of policing law would limit Maine law enforcement officials from engaging in many types of collaboration with that agency or agents of that agency. As rogue immigration agents become increasingly dangerous throughout the country and here in Maine, it's more important than ever that our state and local officials have nothing to do with the chaos, fear, terror, and lawlessness spread by ICE. Our ICE out of policing law exists to protect our communities and ensure that local officials, agencies, and resources are not used to support the federal government's lethal and unconstitutional immigration operations. I'll now hand it over to Ben Gaines from Maine Equal Justice to discuss the ICE out of our homes law.
I apologize. Thank you, Michael. Good morning. My name is Ben Gaines. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the legal director at Maine Equal Justice, a civil legal aid provider and economic justice organization. Among other things, our attorneys provide representation in landlord-tenant disputes, including eviction defense for low-income tenants who, due to immigration status, are ineligible to receive representation from Pine Tree Legal. We should all feel safe in the places where our families live, learn, and heal. The ICE out of our homes law will help real tenants MEJ has worked with, protecting them from landlord behavior that shocks the conscience, but that we have actually observed in the course of our legal work. This winter, at the height of the ICE enforcement surge, we received reports from some of our partners who work with immigrant tenants that a few landlords had begun to use the threat of reporting tenants' personal information to ICE in order to coerce them into waiving protections due under Maine landlord-tenant law. One Friday afternoon, we received an urgent request for help with a landlord in Androscoggin County with a reputation among eviction defense attorneys for having poorly maintained apartments. He was threatening to report immigrant tenants to ICE in response to complaints from tenants regarding their heat, hot water, and habitability of their apartments. Soon after that, we heard about a tenant being threatened with the same disclosure if they did not immediately vacate their apartment without cause, notice, or the protections of Maine's eviction laws. Unfortunately, at that time, there was very little that we could do for the tenants. When tenants apply to rent an apartment, they generally fill out an application that includes personal information like social security numbers, dates of birth, phone numbers, sources of income, and household size. They submit this information for the limited purpose of obtaining housing. But there was no restriction in the law on how landlords could then use the information that they were provided. In response, we worked together with the Maine ACLU, the Maine Immigrant Rights Coalition, Senator Jill Duson, and Senate President Maddie Daughtry in her office to craft a bill that would protect all tenants' personal information. Under the legislation that passed into law this spring, tenants could recover damages of at least $1,000 as well as reasonable attorney's fees whenever a landlord, without the tenant's consent and with the intent to harass, intimidate, or otherwise coerce a tenant to vacate their rental property outside the court process for eviction, discloses sensitive personal information like name, telephone number, email address, or social security number. While the impetus for this was to protect immigrants against exploitation, the legislation that we crafted is generally applicable. It protects every Mainer against landlords disclosing private information like religious beliefs, health conditions, sexual activity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Tenants have a right to feel safe and secure in their homes. Homes have always enjoyed a higher legal standard for the protection of the privacy and safety people enjoy within them. The ICE out of our homes law will help protect renters from predatory landlords and rogue federal agents. I'm now going to pass to Ruben Torres with the Maine Immigrant Rights Coalition.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Michael, for gathering us here today. And thank you to the ACLU of Maine, our fellow coalition members, and everyone who's worked here today to bring these policies forward. My name is Ruben Torres, and I have the honor of serving as the Advocacy and Policy Director for the Maine Immigrants Rights Coalition. We are proud to stand here with our coalition members in support of ICE out of Maine and the vision it represents for our states. We gather here today just 2 weeks after the tragedy in Biddeford. That moment reminded all of us that the decisions and the role that government plays in our lives are not abstract. They affect our neighbors, our families, and the trust that people place in the institutions that are meant to serve them. Every day, we hear from families who are afraid to participate in ordinary life, workers who are afraid to speak up, parents who are afraid to take their children outside, send them to school, or seek medical care. We see businesses lose employees, communities lose opportunities, and all of us lose something when fear becomes a part of everyday life. The ICE Out of Maine policies offer us a different path. They help keep schools, healthcare facilities, libraries, homes, and local public institutions accessible to the people they are meant to serve. They also reflect the central recommendation from our Operation Catch of the Day report. Maine's local agencies have enough responsibility addressing local needs. Local personnel, facilities, equipment, data systems, and public funds should be used for local priorities and not diverted to federal civil immigration enforcement. These policies make it easier for people to go to work, take their children to school, visit a doctor, or use a public space or to call for help without fearing that the local institution they rely on will be used for federal immigration enforcement. If these past 2 weeks have taught us anything, it's this: community is stronger than fear. Mainers have shown up for one another. Neighbors have supported neighbors. Organizations have stood shoulder to shoulder. And Mainers have picked up the phone. Together, we have demonstrated that the answer to fear is not division, it's community. And that's why we're here today, to build a Maine where local resources remain dedicated to local communities. Public institutions earn the trust of the people they serve, and where every family has the opportunity to live, work, and thrive. Thank you, and I now take my time and pass it back to Zach.
Hi, so we can take questions now. It looks like we have one in the chat from Emma at the Maine Morning Star.
Thank you, Ms. Going.
Oh. And so Emma was wondering, given that state law cannot dictate the action of federal authorities when they are performing their lawful duties under the U.S. Constitution Supremacy Clause, can you speak to the limits of these state level measures and gaps in the protections that remain?
This is Zach Hayden from the ACLU of Maine. Maine's new ICE out laws are aimed at people in Maine, regulating the police, regulating the way that landlords or schools or libraries act. Regulating the use of state resources is not only something that state officials are able to do, it's something they're obligated to do. And that's the way that these laws operate. This question really goes to a bigger issue. New ICE out laws are going to provide, while that we should take comfort in them, we should not see them as an excuse to take the pressure off of our federal officials to reform actions at the federal level, regulating street arrests, providing accountability, prohibiting racial profiling. Those are all actions that the federal government, our federal officials, or people who want to represent us in Congress need to take action on.
Great. Thanks, Zach. And next we have Jackie Mundry with a hand raised. So I'm going to take you off mute.
Hi there, thanks for making some time for this press conference. This is Jackie Munder with WMTW Channel 8. I was wondering, is there any data that any of your organizations have that you could share with us about how often someone is being detained by an immigration officer in places like schools or, other places that these laws might impact?
Sue, is that one you'd like to take?
Sure. So, in terms of schools, we don't have recent data, as we're the only statewide organization providing immigration legal services, and we certainly don't have knowledge of every single immigration arrest. In terms of the handovers, only a Department of Homeland Security really has all the data on the arrests. But just speaking to the law enforcement turnovers, we have seen that since LD 1971 was passed into law, the state began to implement it, and some localities are also taking similar action by passing local ordinances. We've seen a drop off of those incidents. What we have been seeing more and more of is people being arrested outside their homes, outside their places of work. I don't know the exact data on some of the other schools and other locations, but what we've been seeing primarily has been people being targeted outside of homes and work or driving. And for the most part, they've been people who have been in a lawful process with work authorization and no criminal histories.
Great. And then the next one, Michael, I'll send your way. It's about legislative process. So Patrick Whittle is wanting to know how the new laws took months to reach the books after they were approved by the legislature.
Patrick, legislation in Maine becomes effective 90 days after the adjournment of that legislature without day or sine die. And that's true unless a bill receives a supermajority vote in both chambers and has an emergency preamble, in which case legislation can go into effect right away. That's why all of the bills passed throughout the last 2 years by the Maine State Legislature, unless they were emergencies, go into effect tomorrow, unless the governor signed them before the adjournment of the first regular session. That's what the Constitution set out for when bills become effective in Maine, and that's why there's such an implementation delay.
Great, thanks. So next we'll have Ari Snyder and then Christian, and then we'll go back and follow the order currently in the Q&A feature. So from Ari at Maine Public is Border Patrol stats show a sharp drop-off in arrests in Maine over the last couple of months. Is there any evidence that that's related to local and state law enforcement making fewer calls to Border Patrol?
Happy to answer that one. We certainly don't know the exact correlation, but we do think there's probably a tie. We have seen a shift in recent months from Border Patrol to more ICE arrests, a more targeted ICE arrests happening, as I said, outside of people's homes and places of work and driving, and fewer Border Patrol arrests.
Thanks. Okay, so Christian, you should be allowed to come off mute.
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah. Christian from Channel 6 News Center, Maine. I was curious about the impact that we might see from the federal government. Has there been any discussion or rumors that you all have heard that there might be a challenge to this, kind of to what Emma was asking, and what authority, if ICE at all, will even regard these pieces of legislation under Maine law? Kind of what does that look like?
This is Zach Hayden. These are laws that are directed at Maine law enforcement and Maine landlords and Maine schools and healthcare facilities. We expect that ICE will continue to ignore the law and ignore the Constitution. That has become their modus operandi. But we expect more from people in Maine. We expect that Maine law enforcement agencies, police departments, sheriff's departments, the state police, the jails, the prisons will follow these laws because this is what the public demands. This is what the people of Maine have asked for, and this is what our elected officials have done. This is the wisdom of the people of Maine of that we're not going to be participating in these federal raids and abusive tactics.
I'd love to add that as early as under the first Trump administration, the federal government challenged a range of non-cooperation laws or ICE outlaws in other states and lost in case after case after case. You'll remember that last year, the federal government withheld funding from Maine institutions, including the University of Maine, in retaliation against words that the governor spoke and policies that the state legislature and some municipalities might have enacted that the president didn't like. Maine sued and won in all of those cases where the federal government retaliated against Maine by cutting off federal funding. The federal government has actually made lots of law over the last decade and a half throughout, beginning in the first Trump term, made a lot of law that strengthens states' rights in this area.
Thanks. And Ian with Maine Newsroom, I think that might have addressed your question, but if not, just raise your hand and send a follow-up. So Emily with the Press Herald, she's wanting to know about the cities that have passed their own ordinances this year, including Rockland, Lewiston, Bar Harbor, and now Waterville. How do those compare with the state law? How do they complement it? And are we still encouraging municipalities to pass their own policies in addition to these laws? So Michael, do you want to take that?
Sure. All of the municipal ICE outlaws complement the state ICE outlaws, and they all go further. They all go further in regulating non-law enforcement officials and in putting a barrier between non-law enforcement officials and federal immigration authorities. As you heard from my explanation, the explanations given by Sue, Ruben, Ben, Zach, the ICE outlaws, certainly the ICE out of policing law, but they regulate law enforcement officials, ICE out of schools and healthcare, public schools and public healthcare facilities. ICE out of our homes restrict landlords. But there are non-law enforcement officials in municipalities, in counties, and at the state level that aren't directly regulated by any of the ICE outlaws. For instance, elections clerks or people who administer public benefits programs. They don't have a law enforcement role necessarily, but information that they're privy to could be weaponized against immigrants, could be enlisted in service of the federal government's deportation operations. And the municipal ICE outlaws that we wrote and helped pass regulate those officials, not just law enforcement officials. And so we regard them as an appropriate complement to the statewide ICE outlaws, and we encourage all municipalities and counties in Maine to pass them.
If I may quickly add to that, part of the reason why we are continuing to encourage that is because it helps remove a lot of that ambiguity from a lot of municipal employees. The questions of what do I do when this happens gets answered before that situation even arrives. And that's why we believe that these types of policies enacted at the local level really help protect a lot of not only local municipal employees, but also the municipalities that those people serve.
Thanks. I would just add one additional thing. I think in addition to the really important increased protections is also the message this is sending to the community. Not only is our state, but our local municipalities and communities are pushing back against ICE, and we want immigrants in our communities, and we want protections. And I think that sends a really important message to people who are really living in such fear right now.
Thanks. So next we'll do a question from Sarah in the Q&A, and then Jackie, I see you've got your hand up, so you'll be right after that. So Sarah from WABI in Bangor is wondering, are there other states where similar laws have been passed? And if so, how successful have they been in practice? And maybe Michael, do you
Sure.
want to start that one off? Cool.
Sure. There are over a dozen states that have passed similar laws. Oregon and California and Illinois were among the earliest, but New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, and a range of other states have enacted similar laws. Success is, as Sue earlier intimated, not a very straightforward thing to measure, but we obviously believe that these laws are important and will be successful. That's why we spent so much time and effort trying to pass them. And that's why we're interested in ensuring that they're enforced. Yeah, I'll leave it at that unless you have a follow-up.
Thanks. And then Jackie, if you want to go ahead and ask your follow-up.
Again, I was just thinking the legislature also will obviously resume in January. These are steps, these ICE out laws, but are there additional laws you want to see passed? And if so, what does that legislation look like? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. There are additional laws that we want to see passed, namely the laws that we've been trying to pass over the last several years and have been unsuccessful at passing. There are, for instance, 2 areas of law in Maine that could use updating to keep up with the times, updating to keep up with new government practices, surveillance-related laws in particular. As you know, there are camera companies, surveillance companies that have been selling cameras to municipalities on the promise that these cameras will increase public safety. And part of the business model of some of these companies is to have tens of thousands of interconnected cameras around the country. Flock is the most famous of these companies, but Motorola, Axon, and others also have the same exact business model. What these companies do is they give law enforcement offices in places like Texas and Georgia access to footage from Auburn, South Portland, and Lewiston, and Bangor, if these municipalities have these cameras. South Portland's Flock camera in particular has been accessed by 44 different law enforcement agencies throughout the country. Federal immigration officials, of course, are interested in gathering as much data as possible about people they want to arrest and deport. And these cameras are a new tool in the arsenal of federal immigration officials. We're interested in taking these tools away from them to the extent that we can through Maine law. And so that's an area that we're exploring and interested in passing legislation in. Another area that we've spent years and years trying to pass legislation in is data privacy. It's not just municipalities and other government agencies that collect lots of data about us. It's also private companies. It's every tech-connected device that we interact with every day. And all of that data ends up being available for sale in the data marketplace. These entities called data brokers create these extremely attractive products for law enforcement agencies, where the agency pays an annual subscription to get access to location information that's sold by aid in federal immigration enforcement operations, can aid in the prosecution of people who come to Maine seeking reproductive care or gender affirming care. Those are a couple of examples of the kinds of legislation we think are desperately needed and will likely be working on over the next couple of years.
Does anyone else want to hop in on that last question?
I'll take the mic real quick and just hop in to say that part of this is one part of our strategy. These ICE out of Maine policies and visions represent a key aspect of security among Maine immigrants and Maine's population and communities as a whole. But there's still other policies that need to be enacted, and we're proud to be working with our partners in developing those in the next term, in this next upcoming term. But things like access to food security and home security are key things that people are keeping top of mind as we head into this next legislature. Making sure that folks feel safe in their homes is a part of this, but making sure that they can have food to put on the table at the end of the day is another aspect that we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be working with a lot of our food delivery and direct service providers to make sure we can have their voices representative in those discussions as well. Thank you, Sam.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I think that's it for questions. So I've got everyone who registered, so I'll go ahead and send you a link to the recording later today, and then just let me know if you have any follow-ups for anyone from the organizations here today. And thank you so much for taking the time to join.